At the age of 19 in 1962, she was
but I have the files. I read this stuff at the National Archives, and I read these other things. I said to myself, how can that be possible? The brain, pistols and frontal slab of choice. I don't know what internet, professional wrestlers, and not just Ventura style. It doesn't matter where the information comes from, as long as it's real. It's hard to get real information. Because seriously, they don't want you to just read these two sources whenever I try to prove out. It's not. You expect your government to tell you the truth, you're going to be sadly disappointed. Another one of these things.
Dear Lord, what a dirty old man, huh?
Really? You can't be serious. Is this really how you want things to be? Come on. More hooker, eruptions. Eruptions, whatever.
Like 8 hours, kind of.
Really?
Allegedly broadcast live from Pima Region 2. Within the borders of the formerly united and currently occupied state of America, we bring you the Ochelli Effect.
I damn sure know I'm an original. We have all these situations. I'd love to know why it takes 50 years. For a 19-year-old girl to eventually get up to gumption to put these things out. Well, it is Saturday night, 8 p.m. on UCY.TV radio, and this is the Ochelli Effect. I know it because I hear all that aggressively loud noise in my headphones right before we go on, and I hear my own voice overdubbed kind of crazily. Anyway, tonight I have a different sort of guest because, as I have had many authors on before, this time we're not going to be going necessarily into the conspiratorial aspects of things right away, although we may touch upon it a bit. The author that I brought for you tonight is Mr. John Kellen, who is the author of Praise for a Future Generation, which is about the first generation of Warren Commission critics. Those of you that do listen to me know that I do have a tendency to hover over the JFK assassination topic just a bit. It is a surprise that I don't do a show on it every single time I go on the air. But Mr. Kellen here has given us an interesting chronicle and something that I do believe has not been paid attention to enough in the sort of literary stream as of late. The history of the actual people that were doing the research and going to the trouble to expose things to the American public. So, Mr. Kellen, how are you tonight?
Pretty good, Chuck. How are you doing?
All right, it's okay on the East Coast today. Despite the tornadoes and all the other madness that occurred over the past week, at least the power and everything else seems to be healthy tonight. So, before we even get into the substance of the book, I'm curious because I always ask this question because I think it is really interesting to know from the author themselves. What sort of motivated you to get into the idea of chronicling this sort of very interesting class of individuals that happen to immediately spring upon criticizing the Warren Commission's findings in 1964?
Well, I've been a writer for just about as long as I can remember, and I've been interested in the Kennedy case for a very long time also. And to tell you the truth, I had wanted for a long, long time to really sink my teeth into a big writing project. And in 1998, a long time ago, I happened to meet Vincent J. Salandria at in Dallas at the National COPA Conference. He was one of the speakers at the conference that year. And for those of your listeners who might not know, he was one of the earliest critics of the Warren Report. He wrote a very early article challenging the validity of the Warren Report that was published in, I think it was November of 1964 just not long after the report came out.
Right, and that's pretty remarkable considering that the report had only come out in September, I think, and shortly thereafter, the 26 volumes were sort of dropped out of the government printing office. And believe me when I tell you, if you want to really torture yourself with some arduous reading, you can go right ahead and try and read the entire 26 volumes. But the actual single volume, the report itself, had come out, I believe, in September.
Yes,
and,
that's right. That's correct.
And you met Vince at the COPA. By the way, COPA stands for the Coalition on Political Assassinations. My listeners might have seen recently that John Judge, who was the longtime head of COPA, had passed away not very long ago. And you know, this is one of the two major groups that has put these conferences together over the years. When you hear about these conferences in Dallas, and COPA actually does conferences in Los Angeles and New York and Memphis as well, because they are not just interested in the Kennedy assassination, but have also spent time putting out and sort of bringing to public attention as much as they could many different deep political issues, including the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Bobby Kennedy as well. Just as a quick little note, but Vince Salandria is a guy, and I'm telling you now, if you just happen to drop into your little search engine and begin to search Mr. Salandria, you'll find that yes, he was quite effectively one of the first people to come out in an intellectual way to begin to argue, to criticize that particular volume, the Warren Commission report, and then later on the contents of the 26 volumes as well. So you met Vince at the COPA conference, like you were saying,
yes,
in Dallas.
Yep.
And that sort of had begun your journey into that interest as well?
Well, I was already interested in the assassination at that point. I had by then been putting out a website / magazine on the Kennedy case that was called Fair Play. Started that actually in, I think, 1994, pretty early on in the history of the web. Vince gave me a copy of his speech that night that I met him, and he gave me permission to put it on the website, which I did. And he ended up I think we exchanged business cards. He called me a couple of months later, and one thing led to another, and we first put together a booklet of his earliest assassination writings, and that's entitled False Mystery, a collection of his work. And it also includes the speech that he gave at that COPA conference that night, which is, in my opinion, a very important speech, really kind of a watershed for me personally anyway, because it articulated so much of what I believe to be true in the Kennedy case. Anyway, sometime around in there, maybe a year or so after I first met him, he offered me, he asked me if I would be interested in having his correspondence from his years as an active Warren Commission critic. And I said absolutely. And within a week or so, he sent me 3 or 4 boxes of letters and newspaper clippings and similar material that ended up really forming the raw material that got me started on what turned out to be praise from a future generation.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to note that among the critics, there actually were various factions of critics throughout the decades since the assassination. And what happened many times, because I was part of some of the correspondence groups, not Vince's actually. I had seen his because they were shared with me by individuals that were in his small little correspondence group at one point. But and I saw some stuff much later, longer I don't even know what year it was. I think probably a few years after you're talking about meeting Vince. I saw some other correspondence just to give me an idea of the type of work that was being done. But we exchanged everything from simply stapling together individuals' typewritten stuff. And again, this is before the internet and before the proliferation of, let's just say, electronic communications the way they are now. We used to just mail things to each other, videotapes, different newspaper articles. Sometimes we would photocopy them. Sometimes you got the original articles mailed to you, depending on which circle you were in. And we would share what was going on locally and different presentations and different media statements as they appeared around the country. But Vince's group was rather fascinating because it really contained some of the more interesting and really intelligent and articulate people that were the earliest Warren Commission critics, right?
Some of them were, yes. So you saw some of that material, huh?
Oh, some, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Some of your, just to for the sake of your listeners, that correspondence group that you're talking about, I was honored to be part of it during the last couple of years of its existence. It had been going on for a long time before Vince invited me to start receiving some of that material. But if anyone's curious, that's described a little bit at the tail end of The Last Investigation, which is a book by Gayton Fonzie. He was a House Select Committee investigator, and he was closely associated with Vince pretty early on in about 64, 65, and then later was with the Select Committee and then wrote his book about that. And he describes that correspondence group, Vince's correspondence group, at the end of The Last Investigation. For any of your listeners who are curious and might have a little and want to find a little background about that.
Yeah, and Gayton Fonzie's book, by the way, is also something that I would suggest to anybody who doesn't have a lot of the sort of intricate knowledge about the facts of the case, and also to get a really serious insight as to what was going on in the 1970s as far as the case went, because we often see the House Select Committee on Assassinations referenced, on the web and in different let's just say, documentaries and, sort of, I don't know what you would call some of these smaller mini documentaries, I guess. But you see the House Select Committee often referenced, and even in news clips, you'll see it. But the thing is that, Mr. Fonzie was part of that time period as someone who was, working on the inside of the investigation. And that book is one of the most enlightening things, that you can pick up out of the, seriously large stream of assassination literature, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, there are, when it comes to the assassination literature, there are probably at most maybe 10 books that I recommend to people on those rare occasions when people ask me what books might be worth checking out, and his book is definitely one of them. And that might be an interesting thing to get back to a little bit later in our discussion tonight, Chuck, is just about some of the better books on the case.
Sure, and you know what? If I'm stepping over you too much, John, just tell me, because I have a tendency to run my mouth a little. Sorry.
No, that's all right. That's okay. Although that gives me an opportunity to say, if you don't mind, I would like to just give a brief, or maybe not so brief, just a kind of a description of my book, if you don't mind.
Oh, absolutely.
So the title of the book is Praise from a Future Generation, and it was first published in hardcover in 2007 by Wings Press, which is a small publisher based in San Antonio, Texas. And it came out as an ebook last October, I think it was, fairly maybe 6-7 months ago, shortly before the 50th anniversary of the assassination. And I think by now, probably Amazon is probably about the only place you can find the book anymore. Either the ebook or the hardcover. But the book is about the earliest critics of the Warren Commission. I usually describe it as being about the grassroots response to the JFK assassination. A lot of the evidence is examined in the book, but it's all in the context of the people who first extracted that evidence from the official record and tried to make sense of it all. So I say first-generation critics. I very narrowly define that as someone. The first-generation critics are those who were immediately skeptical of the story out of Dallas in November 1963, and also acted on their suspicions. Each person that I wrote about began tracking the developing story in the media, and later every single one of them bought the official evidence that was published by the government printing office, and they analyzed it to see whether it could stand on its own. And of course, each one concluded, independent of the others, that in fact that evidence could not stand on its own. And when I say official evidence, you mentioned earlier the Warren Report, and that's exactly what I'm referring to, and not just the single volume report, but as you mentioned before, the 26 volumes of hearings and exhibits, and also whatever documents that the critics could get from the National Archives. And some of the critics, just to mention, I mentioned Vince, we talked about him a little bit, but they also include Mark Lane, Sylvia Marr, and some of the lesser-known critics were people like Shirley Martin and Maggie Field and Raymond Marcus, also Harold Feldman. And the book Praise from a Future Generation is about their work and about their interactions.
And out of those, I got to tell you that I have a particular affinity for Ray Marcus because I was astounded to see the monographs that he was putting out over the years, and the amazing sort of interesting pieces of work that he was coming up with, despite the fact that realistically he wasn't. Like I say, this is before the time of of communication being what it is now. It's easy for us to interact with individuals and to be able to get a hold of certain documents because a lot of them are publicly available. But Ray, when he put together these things, would put together some really incredible stuff. Like the one on the magic bullet, especially, is one of my very favorites.
Right, it's called The Bastard Bullet.
Yeah.
You'll find it in many bibliographies of other assassination books.
And I was going to say that just about every single name you mentioned there, whether it's Sylvia Marr or Mark Lane or any of these people, even if they're not part of the current assassination literature, in very good and very bad books alike, they're always mentioned as the roots of a lot of what you see still proliferating to this day in the literature stream. Yeah. So like you were saying, you got into that group, which are the very earliest critics. Shirley Martin, definitely somebody that you don't see mentioned very often. Sylvia Marr is often mentioned. But that would be more because of the book Accessories After the Fact. But she did a lot of other work previous to that. And, the stuff that led up to that book is also fascinating as well. And we all know who Mark Lane is.
Yes.
So, but anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I mentioned those boxes of correspondence that Vince Salandria sent to me in must have been 1999 that I first got that material from him, and that really it really opened a window to me in terms of understanding how these people, what their thinking processes were and how they interacted during that early period, and what issues were raised early on, and it really they use the kind of the corny phrase for it, sort of like history came alive for me. Because in many cases, the correspondence, they were original letters, and they looked like they could have been written yesterday. Still very well preserved in their original envelopes in many cases. And after Vince sent me all that stuff, I spent a month or more just kind of sorting it all out, and I could see the arc of a story there. It was an incomplete arc, but it was I mentioned wanting for a long time to sink my teeth into a big story, and it just sort of, here it was. It just sort of fell into my lap without my even trying to get it. So, I proceeded to contact as many of those, people that I could. Several, such as Sylvia Marr, had by then died. But another one that I didn't mention before was, Harold Weisberg. He was still living at the time. And, Penn Jones Jr. in Texas. Actually, Penn was by then dead also. He died in 1998. Anyway, I reached out to those who are still around, and to my great pleasure, every single one of them was willing to talk to me. I interviewed everyone that was still around. I visited the archives of Harold Weisberg's and Ray Marcus and Sylvia Marr. Their material, their papers are all archived at Hood College, which is in Frederick, Maryland. And I made a few other research trips to gather material. And it all culminated in the book that came out, as I said, in 2007.
Yeah, well, Harold is an interesting case because he had, I don't think I had ever personally heard of anybody having so many original documents as Weisberg had. At the time he died, I mean, there were just file cabinets and file cabinets filled with this stuff. And he had it actually well organized, unlike some other people. But at least that's what I recall.
Yeah, I never saw that material. I never met Harold in person. We talked on the phone a number of times, but I never got out there to. By the time I got out to Frederick, where he lived, and where Hood College is, he had died, and that material has since been transferred to Hood into his archive, and maybe by now most of it. There's a guy named Clay Ogilvy who had gotten to know Harold in the last years of his life, and he took it upon himself to digitize much, maybe all by now, of Weisberg's material, and a lot of it is accessible online through the Hood College website. I don't know the URL off the top of my head, but I'm sure anybody could find it pretty easily. It was by Googling it.
Yeah, you can search for Hood College online, and you'll find it. They have quite a few interesting archives over there, but Harold's is definitely one that people should look at. And you know what else? Just if you pass through in the video stream of things out there on the internet, Harold was shown many times on, like, say, The Men Who Killed Kennedy documentary series, and has also been seen at various points in all sorts of news reports and things. I remember when Ricky White was making the rounds, sort of, Harold was brought on a TV show with him, and over the years Harold has been one of those go-to guys, and it is a shame that he's gone now, but the fact is that when he was alive, he was a guy that even the mainstream press would kind of turn to sometimes, because he was a very serious investigator. Had been a Senate investigator, I believe, prior to getting involved in this sort of enterprise as well, right?
That's correct. And his background is I go into that in pretty great detail in my book. It's one of the things I did in some respects. My book is about the interactions of these critics, but it also is contains a lot of biographical information about them, their backgrounds, and what led them to November 22nd, 1963, and how their lives were changed by that, and what they did about it.
And like I say, people do remember Mark Lane, and obviously Mary Farrell is a name that comes up a lot because of the website that bears her name, and just she was somebody who was a critic that I even remember in the early releases of the JFK movie. She was on there when they went to one of the conferences in Dallas and all that, and she was another interesting figure in the early days. And I recall hearing stories about her sending people down to immediately get the newspapers when Kennedy was killed and all that, and she started archiving that stuff first, I think.
Yeah, she described that to me in considerable detail. She she saw some discrepancies. Off the top of my head, I don't remember what they were, but she saw some kind of discrepancy early on within hours, and just as a not a precautionary is not the right word for it, but she just decided that she wanted to find out everything that she could. I think she had no idea it was going to end up consuming the rest of her life, but she did send, and she described it as kind of a round robin. She had her husband and sons alternating, just standing out at the loading docks of the two daily papers in Dallas. There were two at the time, getting the first in every edition, I think, of every paper for at least that entire assassination weekend, and maybe a few days beyond that, which is pretty remarkable, really. And she ended up having a pretty enormous personal archive of material as well. I didn't get a whole lot of information about Mary Farrell, unfortunately, and I don't want to really go into it now. This isn't really the place for it, but her standing is taken a bit of a hit in recent recent years, and I think one of the best descriptions of that I've seen is I don't want to plug other people too much, but there's a pretty interesting book that came out maybe a year or so ago called Into the Nightmare by a reporter and writer, a journalist named Joseph McBride. And that is one of the books that I would recommend to anyone that wants to read a little further into this case, but doesn't want to overwhelm themselves with hundreds of titles that are probably going to end up seeming contradictory. But
oh yeah, because it's very easy to get lost in the sea of well over 1,000. I mean, there's minimally 1,000 books published on the subject, and it is interesting to note that there's always contradictory information that comes out with this too, because I know what you're referring to, and yeah, we don't need to go into deep details about that because there's no sense in doing that here. But the fact is that a lot of times there was not always a cooperative sort of effort between the early researchers and the later researchers as well, because people today say that they fight amongst each other, and they still do. This is true, and they always did. And I mean, from day one, there was a little bit of, I don't know how to describe it. It's sort of like these little encampments that seem to be fluid sometimes, and they seem to confront one another and contradict one another sometimes, despite the fact that they're all working for the same goal. That's just the nature of the beast with this kind of thing, it seems to me.
Right. I think a lot of it had to do with just personality differences and different areas of interest, and in some cases, unfortunately, I think some people took a proprietary interest in some of the material. Not everyone, but that was one of the reasons that there was not a great deal of harmony among these critics. But
well, yeah, and like you said, they came from different directions to begin with. I mean, let's just take Mary Farrell for a second. She was certainly nothing like a left-wing kind of person at all. Personality-wise, from what I understand. I mean, I didn't know the lady personally. But I mean, just from what I understand, before this happened, she was not what you would call a left-wing or liberal person.
Nope.
And meanwhile, Mark Lane, on the other hand, I mean, what else could you call him except a left-wing or liberal person at the time? So, just those two figures alone, you'll find a completely diametrically opposed philosophical bent to begin with. But the thing that is remarkable here is that all of these different people coming from different angles, coming from different backgrounds, did all have these sort of, intelligent evolutions toward being critics of the Warren Commission. So I think that's most notable. But you're right, though. Some of those conflicts probably came from things that have absolutely nothing to do with the evidence itself or anything. But meanwhile, there are also conflicts that arise based on different interpretations and feeling that the importance of certain things is of greater value to the truth than others. Let's just say.
Mm-hmm.
But it's all over the place. I mean, there's no one reason why there was conflict. But at the same time, I think there is one main reason why there were so many people working toward that, and that is that they all felt that something was very, very wrong with the official story. And, as you're saying, from day one, Mary Farrell right away found something wrong, and there were others too. But to go on again into some of these other stories, I mean, Mark Lane's story is also fascinating as well.
Yes, it is, and we can talk about that. But one of the things, Chuck, that I think my book demonstrates, and what I believe to be true, is that the assassination was essentially solved by the end of the 1960s. I think it certainly shows that the early critics completely discredited the Warren Report. A few of the early critics, and I document this and write about it, a few of them took the next step and developed working models that explained the why of the assassination. And that's really an important point, because, too many people to this day, I think, are more intrigued by the how of the assassination, the events of Dealey Plaza, when that really isn't going to get us very far. Because by far the most important question is why. Why did it happen? Why did the assassination take place? So,
yeah, I've always kind of felt, and I feel similar to what you feel about it, in that too many people get stuck on the ballistics and the variables of the actual day itself, instead of looking at the resulting things that occurred afterwards, the fact that that we were all basically lied to, it seems to me, and the idea that this kind of thing was, in the hands of the government. They are investigating themselves, and of course they didn't convict themselves publicly, is quite illuminating to begin with. But the fact that a lot of people do get stuck on how many shooters, what direction they came from, and everything else, really the most important point there to me is that the official story is wrong.
Right, and speaking of that, though, I would like to address, since it's come up, I would like to address the events of Dealey Plaza, because I think it's really easy to demonstrate the fact of conspiracy, but it's also important, as I alluded to distinguish between the evidence of Dealey Plaza, distinguish that from the question of culpability. That's the how versus the why. The government concluded that a lone assassin fired from a building behind JFK. We all know that, of course. The evidence clearly shows the government's own evidence from the Warren Report, and even more detail in the 26 volumes. The evidence shows gunfire also came from elsewhere. Now, a lot of this stuff is Assassination 101, but bear with me for a moment, just in case you've got some listeners who are just learning about this stuff. There was a really interesting article, some research done jointly by Harold Feldman and Vince Salandria in probably in 1964 and 65. They were brothers-in-law at the time. Harold Feldman had an article that he published, I think it was in the Minority of One, and it was a study of the Dealey Plaza witnesses. It's called 51 Witnesses, the Grassy Knoll, I think. I think that was the title. But anyway, he demonstrated that out of 121 Dealey Plaza witnesses whose statements appear in the official record, 51, according to his count, and Vince Salandria's count, 51 of those witnesses said shots came from the right front of the limousine, which is to say from the direction of the infamous Grassy Knoll. Mm-hmm. Only 32 witnesses, according to Harold Feldman's study, thought shots came from the building, the school book depository where Lee Harvey Oswald supposedly was, while 38 of those 120 witnesses had no opinion at all. Now, interesting fact is that Kenneth O'Donnell is a former Kennedy aide who was riding in the ill-fated Dallas motorcade, although not in the car with JFK. he was among those who heard shots from the right front. Unfortunately, he didn't tell that to the Warren Commission. He testified to the Warren Commission, but he did not testify truthfully. He told Tip O'Neill, the late Tip O'Neill, the former Speaker of the House, he told him that he said, I testified the way they wanted me to. But he, in fact, was among those who thought he heard shots coming from the direction of the grassy knoll. There was a Dallas cop named Joe Marshall Smith. He was in Dealey Plaza. He testified to the Warren Commission about an encounter he had right after the shooting stopped. He encountered an hysterical woman who was screaming, "They're shooting the president from the bushes." The bushes obviously are not the sixth floor of the book depository. The 8mm Zapruder film. Unambiguous. It shows JFK's head and upper body slamming back and to the left. And, it's just elementary physics that's because he was struck from a bullet coming from the right front, which would be the direction of the grassy knoll. And there's more than this, but as far as I'm concerned, that's all you need to really know to understand that there was a conspiracy in the limited sense of showing more than one gunman, or at least more than something other than what the Warren Commission concluded and reported.
Right, and as a point of reference, you can find Tip O'Neill describing this in a book called Man of the House, which
correct. That's where that Tip O'Neill, that's where that the Kenneth O'Donnell quote comes from.
Right, that was in Tip
fact,
O'Neill's own book.
It's on page 211 of the mass market paperback edition. For those who want to take a note, I just happen to have a note of that in front of me.
There you go. Joe Smith is one of the guys who was riding on a motorcycle in the motorcade and actually drops his motorcycle there and runs up the knoll. I believe it was one of those things that was dramatized in the movie JFK. But his testimony and all this testimony you're talking about, they got it from the government's own evidence, which was in the 26 volumes, which, as you stated correctly earlier, was the hearings and exhibits. And the hearings contain tons of testimony from people that were there and all sorts of figures, some of which I really to this day have no idea why they're in there. But
there's a lot of weird junk in the 26 volumes. There's records of there's dental records of Jack Ruby's mother. Those are in the 26 volumes, and Mark Lane brought that up, and he said those wouldn't be relevant even if Ruby bit Oswald to death. So
right, I have some speeches of Lane's in New York City where he made that point in front of an audience a few times. It provoked some laughter for sure, but it's true. They actually did publish Jack Ruby's mother's dental records from 1940 something or other,
something like that. I mean, it was mother, so.
And a lot of exhibits actually were in there that had literally nothing to do. I mean, if you can tell me how Jack Ruby's mother's teeth relate to the assassination of either Kennedy or Oswald in any way, shape, or form, and like you said, Lane used to joke that, I don't think that this would have been relevant even if Ruby had bitten Oswald to death. That's pretty much what he says, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, that's just the kind of thing. It just seems like a lot of the 26 volumes were filler to begin with. Strangely enough, and yet, the single volume report, is illustrative of what is supposed to be in the 26 volumes. And, it's just really bizarre. And, that study by Feldman is still cited today as one of the, really bedrock pieces of, evidence as far as, the witnesses disagreeing with the, official scenario.
Right. Incidentally, last fall, I put together, a website that I just called it 50. And it was a collection of different articles, a handful of articles, pertaining to the case that I thought were pretty useful reading, in the, at the time of the 50th anniversary. And the Feldman article, 51 Witnesses, the Grassy Knoll, is among those pieces. I don't have the URL in front of me. I don't know if there's any way you can publish this, when this interview ends up on, he said this was going to end up on YouTube or something like that. If there's any way to get it out there, your listeners might be interested in that. There's a lot of, as we've been talking about, there is a lot of junk in the 26 volumes, the Warren Commission's 26 volumes, but there's also a lot of, they're teeming with evidence of conspiracy. Vince Salandria said that Dealey Plaza reeked of conspiracy, and I think that's absolutely true. And a lot of it is in the 26 volumes. And that's really what the first generation critics were occupying themselves with at first, was identifying testimony and evidence from the 26 volumes and comparing it to what was presented in the single volume Warren Report, and finding a lot that was either excluded or misrepresented in the report. And the single volume Warren Report was just everywhere after the Warren Report was first published. It was published in several mass market paperback editions. It was published in in a hardback by the government printing office. It was published in its entirety in the New York Times, for goodness sake. And
right,
but
the New York Times
were much less readily available.
Right. The New York Times even published a paperback version of it. There was a Doubleday version of it, I think. There was just all sorts of different versions of it where they had removed the illustrations, or they had condensed it in some cases. But the original actual government printing office one was out there too. And it was just literally everywhere, it seemed like. All these different publishers were occupied with putting it out there. And again, though, like you said, the 26 volumes, though, were not really readily available until years later. Later researchers would have to discover them in like public libraries and stuff.
Right. That's absolutely true. I think I read somewhere that there were only something like 8,000 sets that were published. So it was not easy to come by, not nearly as readily available as the single volume report. And the significance of that is that the evidence in the 26 volumes is not always accurately represented in the single volume report. That's really the significance of Sylvia Maher's book, Accessories After the Fact. She committed herself to what she called a comparative study of the 26 volumes and how that was represented in the single volume report. And her book is a presentation of those findings, and it demonstrates conclusively how the single volume Warren Report misrepresented much of the evidence, the raw data that we find in the 26 volumes.
Well, yeah, and that's sort of the genesis of what would later grow into, a tremendous, like I said, a tremendous stream of literature that's grown up out of that. But this was really the original grassroots of it. And Sylvia's work, she was, what was she? I believe she was a secretary, or she was a UN secretary, something like this.
No, she wasn't a secretary. She had several different titles over the years. She was, I think, a researcher and a writer for the World Health Organization, which is an agency within the United Nations. So it was connected to the United Nations, but I think it's an entity of its own.
Okay. It's been a long time since I really delved into Sylvia's biography, but and quite honestly, it's been a while since I read your book as well. So some of this stuff is a little hazy to me, but Sylvia is still, and again, every legitimate and decent writer out there who is serious about the subject, who is still covering it to this day, you won't find one of their bibliographies without Sylvia's name in it, though.
I think that's generally true. Accessories After the Fact is a very, very critical book, in my opinion, an very important volume, and it's one of those handful of books on the case that I unhesitatingly recommend to those who are interested. You reminded me of something I wanted to talk about, because some of the truth did get out. Some truth did get out there. One of the things that the early critics did, most of them were doing independent of the others in the early days, before any of the official evidence was published, there was a lapse of about a year between the assassination itself and the time that the Warren Commission completed its work and began publishing first the report and then the 26 volumes. And, there's some interesting things that happened during that time. And I wanted to talk about two rather obscure newspaper articles that I think are pretty important. And both of them date right after the assassination. One is an article by Richard Dudman. He was a reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And he had an article that was published on December 1st of 1963, just over a week after the assassination. I've heard about this article for years, but I only saw it for the first time about a year ago. I got a copy from the Beneficial Hodson Library, the library at Hood College in Maryland that I've mentioned earlier. So Richard Dudman was this reporter. He was in the press bus in the motorcade. And in his article, this December 1st, 63 article, he reports that two doctors, and this is his first-hand account, two doctors at Parkland said Kennedy's throat wound was an entrance wound, which would, of course, bear on a gunshot fired from the right front, from in front of.
Right, because factually, the supposed Oswald position would have given him no opportunity during the time that Kennedy was wounded to have wounded him from the front. So
right.
immediately,
this gets better. I'm leading up to something. This is really good. This is real good. So Richard Dudman also reported seeing a possible hole in the windshield of the presidential limousine while it was outside of Parkland Hospital, which is also indicative, I think, of a shot from the front. Later that same month, Dudman repeated his eyewitness observations in an article in the New Republic, and that article, by the way, is on that 50 website that I mentioned a little while ago.
Okay.
Reports of a throat wound also appeared in the New York Times, interestingly enough. I'm not sure. Tom Wicker may have reported that, but it was definitely in a Times article, and it was published on November 24th, 1963. That would have been the Sunday 2 days after the assassination, the same day Oswald was shot by Ruby. But since it was published on the 24th, it would have been written prior to that. This article, it was on page 2 of that edition of the New York Times, below the fold, and it was headlined, "Doctors Uncertain of Number of Shots." And it said Kennedy suffered, and I quote, "a traumatic wound in the back of the head and a small entrance wound below the Adam's apple." End quote. So right there, a small entrance wound below the Adam's apple. This article has a, sketchy history because it's hard to find. If you go to your local library and look up the Times microfilm or whatever, it's just online digitized these days, but you're going to have a hard time finding it. But I saw a copy of it maybe 15 or so years ago. It was in a display case in Dallas at the 6th floor museum. You're not allowed to take pictures of the museum, so I couldn't take a picture of it as much as I wanted to. But I actually stood there and I copied out the text of this article into my notebook. I'd never seen it before, and I was just amazed to see it. I tried to find that article on microfilm, no luck. It became one of those matters that I always had in the back of my mind. I've got to find a copy of this article. To this day, I've never seen a copy of the article. But about a year ago, I was working with this guy on some stuff related to our common interest here. And the question this article came up again. I mentioned this article to him. He'd never heard of it before, and he was really keen to see it. He had someone looking for it in different libraries. I tried to find it again for the umpteenth time, but we all came up empty. It's just a search for like Ahab, the great white whale. We got to find this article. So this other guy that I was working with, he contacted Gary Mack at the 6th floor, which is where I'd first seen it, whenever that was, in the 90s sometime. And Gary Mack did confirm its existence. I think this other guy's trying to get a copy of it. I'm not sure whether he succeeded. I'd be in love to have a copy of that article, but it does exist. This article that states unambiguously that Kennedy had an entrance wound in the throat. Gary Mack confirmed it. Just this short article in the New York Times published on November 24th, 1963. Kennedy, a small entrance wound below the Adam's apple, quote unquote. So to wrap this up, then we have published reports by Richard Dudman in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and then in the New York Times, both of them first-person accounts of a shot from the front, which is just very powerful stuff as far as I'm concerned. And it appeared right after Kennedy was killed, and Dudman's article is still out there. You can still find that. It took me a long time, but I did finally track it down. And this Times article is really, apparently it was just in the first edition of that day's Times. It's hard to come by, but it does exist. Then another layer of this whole thing, and stop me if I'm boring you, but we have the December 6th issue of Life magazine, good old Life magazine. There's a special place in hell for them. And they published an editorial called End to Nagging Rumors. Have you ever heard of that? Do you know about that?
Yeah, I have a copy of that.
So let me describe it anyway, because it's really good. That's the editorial, as you know. It says the editorial asks, how could Oswald wound Kennedy in the front if he was firing from behind him? Which, according to the Warren Report, that's where he was. Good question, right? But Life answers it with a blatant lie. This is one of those things you need to see it to believe it, but I'll describe it anyway. And this editorial in Life magazine, December 6th, 1963. I've got a copy of it in my office. It says that the Zapruder film shows Kennedy turning in his seat to wave at someone in the crowd. It says he turns in his seat. And let me quote the article. It says, his throat is exposed toward the sniper's nest just before he clutches it. That is a blatant lie, as we know, because the Zapruder film shows no such thing. And Life, of course, had the film in its possession. So not only that, they published frames from the film, maybe even that same issue, and those frames show he never turned. Mm-hmm. So all of this material was out there very early on. So.
But what is strange though, and I'll tell you, I've heard about the Wicker article for years, and I haven't been able to get one either. But the fact is that Life magazine actually published a couple of different versions of the one magazine. Where you have, I have one which has the infamous frame 313 in it, and then one that doesn't. Okay.
Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about.
So
I have all three copies of that. I have the three different issues. It's one of those things that has to be seen to be believed. I don't know if I can paint an adequate word picture of it, but I'll attempt it if you'd like me to. I built a website about that too. It's not as good as seeing the three copies. Ideally you would see all three. Just to clarify for your listeners who might not have understood what you were talking about, it's the Life's issue of October 2nd, 1964. So this would have been, I think, their first issue after the Warren Report was published, and a little over a year after the assassination. Right. There were three different versions of that issue, of that October 2nd, 1964 issue. The issue was, in fact, heralding the publication of the Warren Report, and it had some text under the byline of Gerald Ford, the Foreign Commissioner and future president, which is a rather blatant conflict of interest, journalistically speaking, but that's a separate issue.
And a whole other nebulous subject, really, because, former Warren Commissioner ends up, President of the United States under kind of dubious circumstances, to be kind. Right. First of all, and then the Warren Commissioners themselves are pretty interesting too, because, you have Allen Dulles, who was fired by Kennedy, as the head of the CIA, being really the most active member of the Warren Commission. Earl Warren himself, an interesting character in that whole play. Definitely a subject that, and I don't want to get you off on a tangent about it, but the thing is, if you just take a look at the formation and the selection of the individuals who served on the Warren Commission, and you're not scratching your head when you put them in their proper context to begin with, I don't know what else to tell you. But getting back to it, in that issue, there is a little quote from Ford on the front. And Life magazine participated in a lot of interesting stuff regarding this. Having Connolly examine the film, they claimed, and all these other interesting things to give his version of events, which changed a bit over the years. And but getting back to this whole thing about the three different issues, let's try and paint that picture for everybody.
Okay. Yeah, so it's three different versions of the same issue of Life magazine. The thing about the article came with text by Gerald Ford, like we just said, but it was illustrated with 8 frames from the Zapruder film, which Life had in his possession. Each of those frames had its own caption.
These are just to paint this picture a little bit more. These are the large versions of the frames, which were printed as sort of a special photographic section near the middle of the magazine, I think. Which has, and you got to remember that Life magazine was one of those larger formatted magazines, not like the standard format you see today, and even much larger than, like, say, the National Enquirer and that kind of stuff. It was a large magazine. So you're looking at these things, what would you say? They're about 6 inches wide, at least, the frames?
Oh, yeah, something like that. I don't have a copy in front of me at the moment, but yeah, that's a good estimate, an approximation. Yeah,
it's a reasonable estimate. You're thinking about maybe 6 inches wide and 4 inches high, and these were in color. Prior to that, they had published some other frames also in these other issues. It really occupied Life magazine, I would say, for the next 2 years after the assassination, the subject of the assassination. But the captions and the descriptions that go along with these frames and these articles are absolutely priceless. So go right ahead.
All right. So yeah, they published 8 frames from the Zapruder film, each with its own caption. One of the frames they published was frame 323, and that frame shows Kennedy slammed back against his seat a split second after he was shot in the head. And the caption says, "The assassin's shot struck the right rear portion of the president's skull." Now, this is in contrast to the commission's finding that the shot came from the rear. So, that first edition of the October 2nd Life was withdrawn and replaced with a second version, which was similarly contradictory. And that too was withdrawn, and a third version of the October 2nd Life replaced it. I know it's really hard to visualize all this, and I don't know if I'm explaining it all that well. I think to really understand it, you do need to lay all 3 versions out on a table and see it for yourself. It's quite astonishing, but I do have it on a website, and if there's any way we can put the link to that up on your YouTube version of this interview we're doing tonight, that would I think your listeners would find that very enlightening, because it really all goes to the role of the media in the assassination, and to call it spin control is an understatement. I mean, it's just the worst sort of media manipulation, in my opinion, and to see that kind of irrefutable evidence that shows that something really weird was going on is just astonishing.
Well,
and
you know what I find most astonishing about it, and I'm sure that you talk about this somewhat on your website. I'm just guessing here because I haven't seen it, but I guarantee that you put it in the context of the time, which is that, this is not as simple as taking down a picture off of the internet and replacing it with another picture, or even by today's paper publishing standards. The operation in order to change these things and everything else. I mean, you actually had to manufacture a plate, which would run these things off on a press and everything else back then. It was a very costly and, seriously intricate, venture to make these changes. So the fact that they did go to the trouble to make the change not once but twice, at least that we know of, is really remarkable, because it was costly, it was time consuming, and it was really counterproductive as far as, say getting wider distribution of one's magazine at that time. So, it almost makes you have to ask the question why they would do this kind of thing, what they were involved in, and what the real meaning of these changes was. So,
right. And my view of that is that, there's heavy linkage between, the media and whoever the conspirators were, and they were trying to get their story straight, and they didn't. It took them 3 versions to do that of Life magazine, this major organ of the mass media at the time, but it was important, so they had to get their story right. So it took them 3 versions, but they did. Interesting. I've mentioned Vince Salandria several times. In 1966, Vince wrote to a Life editor asking about these 3 versions. Cause Vince had he wrote an article about it at the time, and the editor wrote him back. The editor's name was Ed Kern. He was an editor for Life magazine. He wrote him back and said, and I quote, "I am at a loss to explain the discrepancies between the 3 versions of Life which you cite. I've heard of breaking a plate to correct an error. I've never heard of doing it twice for a single issue, much less a single story." End quote. He goes on to say that no one seemed to remember who worked on that story. Kind of a cop-out, a total cop-out, really. But, on this, I've mentioned a couple of times that I've built a website devoted exclusively to this question of the 3 versions of Life's issue. And I include a scan of that. I've got an original copy of Kern's reply to Vince, and I scanned it, and it's on the site. It's really one of the remarkable stories of that relate to this case. I describe it a little better, I think, in my book, and I describe it a little bit better on the website than I'm doing here. It's kind of confusing. I still have a hard time explaining it. As I've said, really, I've got copies of all 3 of the different versions of Life, and the easiest way to really grasp what they're doing here is to go to your dining room table and take everything off. It's a nice big flat surface and lay all 3 of those issues out. That's the best way. And you see right there, you turn the page and the pictures are different and the captions are different. They don't make sense. And this one says one thing, but here, this version of it, the caption, also the same caption number 8, contradicts the other one. And, it's just amazing.
And also I defy anyone who has ever seen the Zapruder film, and just about everybody that I've ever spoken to has seen the Zapruder film at some point or other at this time. But I defy anybody to show me the spot where Kennedy is going to be turning around to face the supposed assassin's perch.
It's not there because he didn't do it.
Exactly. But even the other descriptions are also really odd too, because they're one of those versions, which I know I have. I mean, the picture literally is described inaccurately. I mean, to a degree that, okay, Life magazine, let's just understand something. Life magazine was like one of the standards, in America, certainly in American journalism, as far as, bringing pictorials and, sort of carrying the weight of the national story. I mean, you couldn't have found a local newspaper or TV broadcast or news broadcast probably anywhere in the country that several times a week was not citing something that had been printed by Life magazine, that had been explained in Life magazine. It really was sort of a cornerstone in American journalism. And he is very right to have said to Vince that, it's unheard of for them to have broken the plates like they said, because, like I said before, it was very costly and, very problematic for them to do this because they had to produce these things and then ship them, in 1960s, terminology, shipping out a magazine, was not something that was done easily or without a lot of time being consumed. Not to mention the monetary aspects of actually breaking and redoing the plates. That's just really more astonishing than I think I can explain to anybody at this point in time,
Right. And for those of your listeners who are intrigued by this question of Life and the 3 versions of the Life magazine, the October 2nd, 64 issue, I do write about it, in my book, Praise from a Future Generation. Vince Salandria wrote about it in an article, I think it was published in Liberation magazine in the mid '60s, and that's included in the
I know that's in False Mysteries too, right?
That's in False Mystery, and also there's another critic from the '70s. He's still around today, I think. His name is Jerry Polikoff. He's also written extensively about it. He wrote about it in an article that was included in probably a pretty difficult to find paperback called Government by Gunplay, and he also wrote about it in an article that was, I think it was originally in the Village Voice, but it was included in JFK, the book of the film, the of the Oliver Stone film. There's a book that came out shortly after the movie that has a version of the screenplay. It wasn't the shooting script, but it was a version of the screenplay, and then there was it was supplemented by additional material, numerous articles that appeared around the time of the movie.
Yeah,
and included in that is the Jerry Polikoff. I think he co-authored an article that was originally in the Village Voice, and then was included in that JFK, the book of the film. So anyone who's interested can find out more information about it there.
Yeah, that's for sure. And as a matter of fact, you can find copies of that, probably used copies of it floating around fairly cheaply if you wanted to. The JFK book of the film, which is an annotated, they call it an annotated screenplay. It's obviously not the shooting script like you just said, but it's, it's an easy to follow. If you're familiar with the movie, you can follow the script, and you can, you're shown through there, by the authors and the people who put it together, exactly where these ideas came from, because at the time there was a lot of criticism about the movie, that it was, made up wholesale. It was a fairy tale, and they were showing the real sort of places where they gathered the information that they utilized to dramatize the story. At the end of the day, I mean, it was a drama and all, but it wasn't as though it was not based in factual evidence that they had their hands on at the time. And oddly enough, to be honest with you, the more that one peruses the newer archives that were brought about by the Assassination Records Review Board, you could probably add to that annotated script and find a whole bunch of other supporting things to go along with a whole lot of stuff in that movie. I'm certainly not saying that everything in there is the gospel, let's just say, but without a doubt, there is a whole lot more fact there than fiction. So,
yeah, I agree. I think it's an important movie. There are some regrettable inventions in it that I think just handed Oliver Stone's critics just handed him some ammunition,
yeah, certainly.
They went ahead and used it, and that's unfortunate because I don't think it was necessary. But there it is. It's out there, and overall, though, I think it remains a very powerful.
Well, it was very powerful, and I would say that, you're right. There's a lot of sort of regrettable things that if I were an advisor to Mr. Stone at the time, I certainly would have encouraged him to leave them out. But to be honest with you, on the overall, it did contribute to the conversation, and the sort of need for a greater sort of transparency, so far as our dealings with the National Archives and the official record of the entire situation surrounding the assassination was given a lot more depth, let's just say, by the release of a great many formerly classified pieces of material that came about because of the outrage from the film. So I'd say that on the whole, it did us a lot of good as far as getting closer to the greater realities of a lot of the things that surrounded the assassination. But that's my opinion again.
No, I agree. I agree completely. I mean, it obviously it put the issue back on the national agenda, and it's unfortunate that we didn't have something of equal power that did it again at the time, just this past fall, at the time of the 50th anniversary. I think that movie was re-released, but it didn't get nearly the publicity and distribution that it did the first time around.
All right. And, and we could discuss the mass media's approach to the 50th anniversary. And I mean, believe me, you want to talk about regrettable and horrendous stuff. I mean, I didn't even want to participate in anything around the time of the 50th anniversary because honestly, I felt, and I've said this several times on the air when I've been asked about it even, that it really felt to me like the circus had come to town and that I was looking at a lot of clowns and a lot of distortion and a lot of, repetition of the old myths that originally were challenged, as you said, even in the days immediately after the assassination by this really inventive and intelligent set of first generation critics. And Penn Jones is another guy who, because see, my radio network runs some of the Mae Brussel broadcasts from earlier times, and she was friendly with Penn, and Penn is even on a couple of them. I think that they rebroadcast now on the overnights. So this is a guy who was also rather interesting. The four volume set of books are very hard to find. They were called "Forgive My Grief," I think.
Yep.
And would you like to talk about Penn a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I never met him, unfortunately. I met his son in Dallas shortly after the book came out, and talked to him a number of times. His son, that is, Michael. He was very helpful to me in getting some documents that I really needed to kind of round out my picture of Penn. But yeah, Penn Jones is a very another one of the people that I wrote about in the book. A very important figure from that period. He at the time of the assassination was publishing a small a weekly newspaper in Midlothian, Texas, which is about a half hour or so outside of Dallas. And he was like a lone liberal voice in a very conservative town, very conservative state. But he was at the Dallas Trade Mart, as a matter of fact, on November 22nd. I think he was a big Kennedy fan. He liked him quite a bit. I think he met him briefly at one point, just as shook his hand on some campaign stop, in some years prior to the assassination.
And for the listeners, the Dallas Trade Mart was the destination of the motorcade that day on its way through Dealey Plaza.
Correct.
So people
know.
He
was supposed to address a business luncheon there or something like that.
Right. I mean, he was making several, public appearances at, luncheons and breakfast meetings and things, and had been in Texas for a couple of days doing this. He was in Fort Worth the morning before. He had just gotten off the plane, by the way, at Love Field. I'm sure everybody's heard of Love Field, and the motorcade actually was traveling from Love Field to this luncheon where a lot of reporters were waiting to greet the president in Dallas, and Penn was actually there waiting for him.
Right, as a member of the press, as the publisher of this weekly newspaper. That was his how he got the credentials, the press credentials to be there.
Right.
And it's interesting though, he Penn Jones actually passed through Dealey Plaza on his way there, and he said many years later that he thought at the time, this would be an interesting place to watch the president, but no, I got to get to the Trade Mart. So he could have been there. That would have been pretty amazing. But anyway, he, as the owner and publisher of his own paper, he was in a unique position to be able to editorialize from the get-go. He had a forum that he could write in, and it was a pretty small paper, not much of a circulation, but nevertheless, he did get his material out there. It
was called the Midlothian Mirror.
Correct.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Forgive My Grief, his 4-volume set. The first one, and most of them, in fact, were originally collections of his editorials that he originally published in the Midlothian Mirror, and he was one of the first to call for a reopening of the Warren Commission. He was one of the first to say that. He had a really funny quote he gave to Mark Lane. Mark Lane, and another early critic who traveled to Dallas on several occasions, and he and Penn had a working relationship. And Mark Lane published a book called Rush to Judgment, and he made a film version of the book, and he interviewed Penn Jones in that movie. And Penn had kind of a funny quote. He said, "I really believe the only way you can believe the Warren Report is to not read it." And I think that pretty well sums up the status of that that book. Penn did a lot of his own legwork. He was initially working, as most of them were, trying to understand the nuances of the 26 volumes, this massive amount of material, and at the same time was trying to track down some of the leads that he was hearing about as a working journalist, and also that he was picking up on from the 26 volumes. He spent a lot of time trying to find a woman named Earlene Roberts. She was the housekeeper. I think it was her position at the rooming house that Lee Harvey Oswald was staying in at the time of the assassination. Right. And she had some really interesting testimony in the Warren commissions that I think it was only in the, don't know whether she's mentioned in the Warren report or if it's just in the 26 volumes, but she describes how, Oswald came bursting into the house shortly after the assassination and it was in his room for, I don't know, however long it was, a few minutes, and then left again.
Well, right.
While he was in his room, she said that a police car, came up, pulled into the driveway in front of the house and honked its horn a couple of times. So, which is pretty suggestive of, draw your own conclusions, but that's pretty unusual. And, that was one of the many leads that was never really followed up on by the Warren Commission, and its investigators, which means the FBI. But so that was one of the things that Penn Jones was trying to find out and follow up on his own. He never did find Earlene Roberts. He found a couple of people named Earlene Roberts, but they were not the right one. And she ended up dying, I think, when within a year or two of the Warren report coming out. So he never found her, and then she was dead. So.
Yeah, and what's significant about that is if you think about why it is that it's interesting they wouldn't follow that up, is that, shortly thereafter, after, the narrative emerges that Oswald, ends up taking this kind of strange trip to his rooming house where he first jumps on a bus and ends up taking a taxi past the rooming house and then goes on foot back to the rooming house and then leaves the rooming house on foot, after the assassination occurs. But then shortly thereafter, after he flees from there, from this rooming house where he was staying separately from his wife, closer to his work, the odd thing is that, of course, if you put it in the context of this man is supposed to have shot J.D. Tippit while he was on foot immediately pretty much after leaving there on his way to the Texas Theater. And if police officers were beeping their horn right outside of his, the place where he's staying or his residence at the time, it seems a little strange and maybe seems almost like the meeting with Tippit might not have been so accidental. That was part of the reason for it, but there's all kinds of strange sort of things that happen there. And I think that the anecdote was mentioned in the report itself, and I'm pretty sure that they made reference to somebody's testimony, but I don't know if it was Earlene Roberts actually, because I don't recall her being in one of those indexes. But it could be my mistake as well, but it's still a very cloudy, strange thing, and why they wouldn't have followed up on the police having been involved in being near his residence and maybe either signaling him or looking for him ahead of the time that he supposedly calls attention to himself by going into a movie theater without paying for a ticket is very, very suspect indeed. But Penn chased down a lot of stuff like this, didn't he?
Yes, he did. He was also very fascinated by, and I may get some of the facts wrong because I haven't read this in a while, but he wrote about a meeting that he said took place in, I think it was in Jack Ruby's apartment. And it was the night of the 24th. So Jack Ruby would have been in jail by then for shooting Oswald, but it was a meeting between George Senator, who was Ruby's roommate, and I think a reporter named Jim Cody, a reporter for I think the Times Herald, and was it Tom Howard? He was Ruby's first lawyer. Right after he was arrested, he turned up as his lawyer. The three of them met in the apartment that evening, and no one really knows what they talked about. But the curious thing is that within a year, I think all three of those people were dead. So that was something that Penn also was writing about and wondering about for a long time. I don't think he ever came to any conclusions. It was just one of those things that was so weird. He wanted to find out what was going on. What did they talk about?
Well,
and he
right.
wrote about that in one of his books. I'm not sure which one it was, probably the first or the second one.
Right, and in one of those volumes, he started what became really part of the lore that has gone throughout the generations of researchers. The whole convenient deaths lore, which has gone on. But what he was assembling was, over the first couple of years, the people that were witnesses to events or were somehow tied to events or tied to people that met a bunch of untimely or slightly suspicious deaths, depending on who they were. But he was best known for that, I think, and also, there was other things that Penn Jones was known for sure. Again, I point to that whole, the men who killed Kennedy, which has made the rounds all over the place. If you recall, he's the guy who you see on the grassy knoll who really started the whole moment of silence thing on the grassy knoll during the anniversaries of the assassination. But also, as you mentioned, he was prominently featured in the Rush to Judgment movie. And I think actually helped Mark Lane a bit, gathering people and things like that for that movie. I may be a little off on that because Mark had his own resources, but I think that Penn was one of those people that was locally helping Mark locate people and things.
I don't know exactly what his role in that was, but yeah, he was featured in that movie. Well, I was just thinking something and now I forgot.
I'm sorry, I have a tendency to do that to people, John.
No, that's all right. I was going to follow up on something you said, and now it's slipped out of my head. I should have jotted it down.
Maybe it was the list of convenient deaths, that thing?
Yeah, I think it was. I think that a lot of these things get blown way out of proportion, and I think there's no question that many of these deaths are indeed suspicious, but a lot of them, I think, the list just keeps growing and growing. And I said overall, there's a book called Crossfire, which I think overall is a pretty fair summary of the evidence that was known up until the time it was published. But it did include I don't know if it was a list or whether it just mentioned a fantastic number. It was well over 100 that were mentioned in the book. And I think that it's one of those things that just gets blown out of proportion and is seized on by the mainstream media in just dismissing a whole area that's really important, which is to say the assassination, and making those of us who are treating this as a serious issue, making us look ridiculous.
I agree.
But there's no question that, for example, Lee Bowers, he's an extremely important witness, and he died under very strange circumstances. So did William Whaley. You mentioned we were talking about Oswald getting from the book depository to his rooming house. He was the cabbie that drove him, I think, the last leg of that journey from Dallas into within a couple of blocks of the rooming house, not right up to it, but within a couple of blocks. And he ended up dead within a year or two. And James Whaley, he was one of the witnesses in Dealey Plaza. He was, I think, only 19 or 20, and he died in a motorcycle accident within a couple of years of the assassination. I mean, it at some point it gets to be more than just a coincidence, but unfortunately, I think it's often presented as such a inflated list that it's made to look ridiculous. And I don't know who inflates it, because I think, well, it gets in a whole area of who.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And you know what the problem is? That initially when Penn was gathering this stuff, in the early days, it was very curious. And he wasn't adding, I mean, some people have conflated this list, with some really odd things where it's like, well, this person was the housekeeper for this person, and it's like, yeah, but they weren't. And then if you look at it closely, they weren't really their housekeeper. It's not like they were only hired by them, but they happened to have cleaned an apartment at some point. And, it gets blown out of proportion because other people that are being irresponsible with it have picked it up and ran with it. But the early core list of this stuff where people who passed away at very young ages. In some cases, there were, singular vehicle car accidents. And
well, that was Lee Bowers was a single car accident.
Right. I mean, and there was, there is the case of Roger Craig, which, a lot of people do argue about, but I mean, the fact that the guy, commits suicide with a weapon that he doesn't have registered, and all of the other sort of strange things that happened with him. I mean, we could get into him too, but, but there was all of these very curious occurrences. And let's just say that even if, the responsible look at that stuff, where you actually take a sort of statistical look at what realistically should happen to a grouping of people that happen to coalesce at that time and everything else. If you were able to dismiss, even, 50% of the list completely, and I mean the original core lists, it's still something that is rather curious. And I just mentioned it as one of the things that Penn sort of spearheaded in a way. Unfortunately, whether things are legitimate or they're a little bit more vaporous than they should be, sometimes other people pick them up and sort of twist the real significance of them into something that in sometimes does become somewhat laughable and ridiculous. And you're right, I could never really identify who inflates these things, that's for sure. But it is an interesting study, and one of those things that they do try to use against anyone who asks legitimate questions. They often turn around and say, well, you people also believe 500 people have died this way, and it's like, I never said that, but okay.
Yeah.
You're hanging that on my neck now because of something you read after somebody else picked up something fourth hand from the original person. I just mention it as, since it's one of those things that does always come up, that Penn actually was there locally, first of all, and legitimately seeing people in a very small area, a sort of limited sample of the population was dying off, and a lot of it under strange circumstances. I mean, there's also the case of I believe it was Simmons, who was in the film with Lane. I can't remember if it was Simmons but it was one of those witnesses, and his first name was James. I remember that clearly. But if you remember, he was suddenly shot in the head by somebody on a street corner for no reason. And shortly thereafter, he didn't have very much to say. He survived the gunshot to the head. But I mean, there was a lot of weird sort of things like this happening, to anybody who said anything, that was, in contradiction to the official story, and the, anything that sort of made the local authorities look bad too. So, I mean, there's a legitimate part of that. But then, like you, both of us have definitely stated, I mean, it's been really blown out of proportion, and is used by some to make us all look ridiculous. But there are literally ridiculous aspects to it as well that have gone out there too. Yeah,
there's a lot of junk out there, and I think that a lot of this case has really been mythologized. As far as I'm concerned, I think that there's a lot of junk out there, and there's also a lot of stuff that serious people take at face value. For example, I'm sure you're familiar with the Alan Dulles quote about how nobody reads. I may have finally found a source for that. Apparently, maybe he did say that. It's too many people, like I said, they want to waste they waste their time on the how. We talked about this a little bit at the beginning. When the real question is why. I think we all follow our interests and abilities, and where those interests take us, vis-a-vis this case. So if somebody has the skills to evaluate, say, the medical evidence associated with a case, then of course it's only natural that they do so. I just don't know what anybody expects to prove by looking at that stuff at this late date. I've said things like that before and pissed people off, but because they think I'm full of it. But I think, I mean, I guess the answer is that what they expect to prove is that proving falsification of certain records is going to link to whoever had possession of those records during key periods of time, and thus goes to culpability. That's all I can figure. It just doesn't interest me all that much. I think conspiracy was proven decades ago, yet here we are, 50 years later, still talking about some of the same issues that were, being discussed in the 60s. I think there's way too much time and effort spent on the questions like, was this Zapruder film a fake? I know this is probably an unpopular position, especially insofar as the Zapruder film goes, but I mean, I think you only have to look at the conventional Zapruder film, the one we've come to know and be horrified by, to understand that there was a conspiracy. And yet here we have so-called experts who call it into question, the practical effect of which is to prolong the debate. And whose interest does that serve? Prolonging the debate. Whose interest does that serve? Because there's nothing to debate about anymore as far as the question was there a conspiracy? And there hasn't been for a long, long time.
Well, right. I mean, that's why I a few years ago started to switch things around a little bit, in my own language whenever I would, write anything about this. I stopped, identifying, people as conspiracy theorists. I call, and myself, in fact, I call myself a conspiracy advocate. And the individuals who want to cling to that lone nut story, I call them the lone nut theorists, because effectively that's what they are, in my opinion, because their theory is, lacks foundation and lacks the evidence, even according to the purveyors of the official story. I mean, as we've stated here, what they printed in 1964 contradicted their own conclusions. And here we are, nearly 50 years after that was published, still, confronted with the mainstream media's nonsense, that basically says, look, despite all of this, interesting sort of wrangling that's gone on among people who want to theorize and argue with each other, still the official story stands up. And that is awfully, again, educational for all of us, because the more that we spend time arguing about, some of these, I don't want to call them inconsequential issues, but I mean, if we all simply accept the idea that, look, there was a conspiracy here, the government did attempt to tell us otherwise, but that is the end of the story there. And if you want to get into culpability, and if you want to understand the why, perhaps it would be better to study that as opposed to the particulars and the minutia of all these other sort of sub issues involved in the case. So, I mean, I have no problem with anything you're saying here. I mean, I may disagree with you on a few things, but realistically, it seems as though we seem to both agree that the case was clearly not as we were told it was initially, and even though they have not, done a mea culpa for us, and I don't believe that we should expect that they will anytime soon, it's pretty much a fait accompli that that's what it is.
Agreed. I agree.
So, but returning to the subjects of the individuals that really laid the groundwork for, unfortunately, some of the bad stuff, but also the best stuff out there, the groundwork was laid for, in the early days. We haven't even really touched on, I mean, we've mentioned Mark Lane a bunch of times, but to get into Mark Lane is an interesting story in and of himself, because, he was previous to getting involved with this, particular subject. He had been, I believe, a New York State Assemblyman.
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
And as I said earlier, he was more of a left wing, definitely far left of JFK even, as far as a politician was. He was kind of a social activist in a way, also a lawyer, but at that time, a very young man who, effectively got involved in this in a sort of strange way. He tried to write an article, which they wouldn't publish in too many places, and then, he finally did get it published. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. He wrote an article that was based on some of the discrepancies that he saw in press reports after the initial assassination weekend, after the dust kind of settled, so to speak, and Kennedy was dead and Oswald was dead, and the Warren Commission was just beginning to form, and Mark Lane, like all of the other critics, was seeing a lot of the contradictory information that was in being published in the press. But as a defense attorney, a criminal defense attorney, his overriding concern at that point was the idea that, Oswald was denied his most fundamental rights.
Well, right,
as an accused. And
Lane, as I said earlier, though, was, definitely sort of a civil libertarian, a civil rights activist in a way, as far as wanting to see many people, in fact, having their rights observed and granted to them, and initially was kind of bothered by the fact that Oswald, despite never having gone to court, never having been convicted, was pretty much convicted in the court of public opinion. So yeah, that's definitely where I would go from there. And he saw all these interesting differences in the press coverage. And meanwhile, he decides to write this article.
Right, which he proceeded to do, and it took the form of a defense brief, as writing from the point of view of a defense attorney. And as you mentioned, he, as a former assemblyman, he had some pretty good contacts and pretty good connections. He went to places that he thought he could easily get his article published, places where he had previously been published, and for example, The Nation was one of them, and several other newspapers and magazines, and everybody said no, he couldn't get it into print, and he finally was able to place it in a national newspaper called the National Guardian, which was published by, I'm not sure exactly who published, but but it was basically an organ of the Socialist Party, I think.
Well, it was clearly a left-wing publication, and it's not to be confused with the Guardian that we see on the internet now, which is the European-based paper. It's a totally different thing.
Correct.
And existed at that time more as an organ, like you said, of the socialist or the left-wing sort of American mindset. So yeah, that's definitely worth noting as well. So go on.
The article, it had a huge impact, and the Guardian sold out really quickly. It got a little blurb in an article about the article, appeared in the New York Times. I think it was December 18th, 1963, if I'm not mistaken. That's just off the top of my head, but I think that's correct. And the interesting thing about that was that a lot of the people that came to became known as the first generation critics of the Warren Commission, they saw his article and they had that sense of, wow, I'm not alone. There's somebody else, somebody is finally writing about this thing that I've been feeling in my gut, for the last month since the assassination. It had the effect of turning Lane and his office as kind of the focal point for a while, for a lot of the first real groundswell of reaction to the contradictory reaction to the Warren Report. So that was really the significance, I think, of that article. And I mentioned very briefly a while ago Shirley Martin, who was this woman that was living in Oklahoma, in a small town called Hominy, Oklahoma. She was also, like the other critics, she was immediately skeptical of the story out of Dallas. And one of the things that she did was she started subscribing to Dallas newspapers and to the New York Times. So she saw the Times article about Lane's article and eventually got a copy of Lane's National Guardian full article. And she actually sent a copy to Marguerite Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald's mother, Marguerite Oswald in turn contacted Lane and had the effect of drawing him further into the case and getting him further involved. So, yeah, it was a very important early article that had these kind of unforeseen consequences, but all to the better, I think.
Well, right, and there was a lot of people that were not just the first generation researchers who you can find nowadays, but there were other individuals who were corresponding with them, helping them, and everything else. And there was a lot of people that were simply skeptical about the that weekend in Dallas, let's call it, and the way that the events unfolded and how quickly the media had couched the entire situation. And a whole bunch of people that I've spoken to over the years that were alive at that time do cite that article as first being mentioned in a couple of different places. The New York Times was one of them. But the fact that it got a lot of sort of attention, among people that were skeptical to begin with, did wind up leading to, like you said, Shirley Martin passing along an article to Marguerite Oswald. And, Marguerite Oswald, for those who don't know, was Lee Harvey Oswald's mother. And, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald having been dead already, and the Warren Commission being formed to investigate the case. Of course, an interesting note there is that, the first two sort of subdivisions of the Warren Commission's investigation immediately involved Lee Harvey Oswald. So we knew where that was going. But the fact is that Marguerite Oswald then in turn winds up contacting Mark Lane, right?
Yep.
And you want to talk about what happens after that?
Well, it ended up drawing him further into the case. I think he said that he didn't think, he wrote his article, he wrote his defense brief, he got it published. He sent a draft to Earl Warren or someone within the still forming Warren Commission, but he assumed that was going to be the end of it. That was be the end of his involvement with the case. But no, as it turned out, he was contacted by Marguerite Oswald, and she asked him to represent her dead son before the commission. And he agreed to do that somewhat reluctantly. Although as it turned out, the commission said, well, you can't do that because we're not this isn't a trial, so so he can't have, Lee Oswald can't have representation because we're not putting him on trial because he's dead, and so he was not allowed to do that. But he did end up going to Dallas and investigating some of the leads that he had early on, and he was, for the better part of a year, he was the lone voice of dissent, or certainly the highest profile voice of dissent.
Well, right. He was probably the easiest to find, voice of dissent in the early days for sure. But what I found fascinating about him being drawn further into the case is, although they denied his request to sort of represent Oswald's interests in front of the commission, they instead put someone else from the American Bar Association in his place to sort of represent Oswald's interests. And then after that, I'm not exactly sure how long after that happened, they actually called Lane in to testify in front of the Warren Commission instead of letting him participate as Oswald's representative. He was brought there and asked questions about his involvement in investigating the case.
Yep. Yeah, and it's funny when you read it because his testimony says, "Look, I've got no firsthand knowledge of any of this. Everything I have to tell you is hearsay," and yet they compelled his testimony. So it's very strange how that ended up working out. But there it is. His testimony is there.
Oh yeah, and it's in you can find him in the 26 volumes as one of the people who testified. And, but it is really strange reading, right? Because it's like, listen, first of all, he protests pretty much by saying that, look, I'm here and I'm here voluntarily, but quite honestly, I don't have any firsthand knowledge, so I don't know, So I don't know what it is that you expect to gain from my testimony today.
Yeah, but he did. That's true, and it does say that. But he did get a lot of interesting information on the record that may not have been there otherwise. So, such as the fact, the whole question about I'm not really an expert on this, but he got on the record the whole question of the notorious photograph that Life magazine put on its cover in February 1964, of Oswald, supposedly in the backyard of his apartment building, brandishing, a pistol and a rifle that they say was the assassination weapon. And it was clearly a doctored photograph. You can see that in different versions of the picture. There's just, in some, the telescopic sight on the rifle has been airbrushed out. And so he got facts like that on the record. And if those don't raise any red flags, then I don't know what does.
Yeah, and he winds up going through a whole thing with that because that is the infamous what is always referred to as the backyard photograph.
Right.
And it's something that I'm asked about all the time, and that's the one that literally everybody asks about, with the shadows not looking like they're being cast the right way in the photograph. But it was again the front page of Life magazine, who had put it out nationally. And it was kind of curious to hear that he had difficulty even acquiring the photograph. He wanted a copy, like a glossy copy of it, and he was requesting it from a couple of different media outlets who had told him that they couldn't even pass along a copy of the photograph to him because of some agreement they had, which also included not being able to divulge to anybody what the original source of that photograph was.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm not I'm not really an expert on that area, so I don't know the history of the photo. But yeah, the whole thing of that photograph is a subject in and of itself.
Oh yeah, definitely. I just mentioned it as a little bit of background for it. I mean, I'm not claiming to be entirely expert on the situation with that photograph. Outside of some work. I mean, I've done some work on it because I don't know anybody who hasn't looked at the assassination, who hasn't stared at that photograph for some amount of time and wondered what the hell is actually going on in that picture.
Right. One of the Jack White was, the late Jack White was one of the real authorities on that photograph. And he did a lot of work on that and came to the conclusion that it was a faked photograph, as Oswald himself said in a report, police report that's included in the single volume Warren report. I think it was quoted him. I think it was Will Fritz that quoted Oswald as saying that was a faked photograph. And Jack White, who has had an extensive background in photography, had the skills to really analyze that picture, came to that conclusion as well. And he did some writing, extensive writing on it, and had a video on it, and some other stuff. So
right, it kind of looks like a little news report. It includes him and Jim Mars, who is the author of Crossfire, which you had mentioned earlier. Which, by way of also connecting the dots here, Crossfire is one of the books that was optioned for the film JFK,
right,
as kind of a point of reference. And I think a lot of versions of it actually say that on the front of it now. At least the trade paperback does. I know that. But Jack White did a lot of work on it. I mean, and he actually did a lot of interesting, extensive work on it, including kind of breaking down the difference between the size of the newspapers in the photograph and examining the weapons which are depicted in the photograph. But again, this is a very strange sort of photograph. There's a couple of different versions of it out there. And Life magazine, again, its cover basically says Lee Harvey Oswald pictured with the weapons that he used to kill the president and J.D. Tippit.
Yep.
So again, we have Life magazine participating in pretty much the conviction in the public mind, sort of Lee Harvey Oswald, again without the benefit of a trial or without the examination of the evidence or without an honest sort of viewpoint on a lot of stuff. And that's rather educational in and of itself. If you just sort of track, the way that Life magazine handled the case throughout the years.
Right. But, all this stuff is really fascinating, and it's really easy to get caught up in a lot of this minutia because it's so compelling. But it really does get to what I was saying earlier about how this case, in my opinion, is so mythologized. And it kind of leads me to one last point that I'd like to make in the remaining time that we have tonight, Chuck, if you don't mind.
Sure, go ahead.
And we had talked at the beginning of our interview about all the books that have been published in the case. And I mentioned The Last Investigation. I think one of the best of its time. It was first published in I think in 91 or 92 thereabouts, or maybe 93. Mm-hmm. It was written by Gaten Fonzie, and in that book, among many other things, it's his personal account of his personal involvement with the House Select Committee, of which he was an investigator. And in that book, he said there was something like 600 books had been published on the JFK assassination up to that point in time. Mm. I think 600 titles may have been a conservative estimate, even 20 years ago, but whatever. Certainly the advent of ebooks and print on demand and all that has made self-publishing easier than ever, and by now we're absolutely awash in books on this case.
Oh, absolutely.
And I was thinking about that last fall, around all the hoopla surrounding the 50th anniversary, and I posed the question on an internet forum, asking how many do you think, and most of the replies were, most people who answered thought it was well over 1,000 titles. So, I, just for the heck of it, I went into my office and I stood in front of my own bookshelf and I counted all the books in my own collection. And I didn't include some of those that just discussed the case peripherally. I really limited myself to books that were specifically about the assassination. Mm-hmm. So even excluding some titles, because they maybe only had a chapter or so on it, even excluding that, I counted about 150 books that I have that bear directly on the assassination. And I am not one of those readers who collects methodically or buys every new book that comes along. These are just what I happen to have. Now, 150 titles on a single subject is an awful lot, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. Many of these books, of course, they contradict many of the others. Mm-hmm. And I probably would not recommend most of them. Ray Marcus, you mentioned Ray Marcus earlier in our discussion, and he's one of the earlier critics that I wrote about in my book, Praise from a Future Generation. Ray told me that he thinks that the effect of all this, of all these different books, and all this conflicting information, is to keep the future historians, out of it. Ray told me that in his opinion, there's so much junk to wade through, so much disinformation to sort from useful information, that the effect will be to discourage future mainstream historians from studying the case. Now, by the same token, ordinary readers who might only read one or two books on this subject, I think, are going to be hopelessly confused, whether they know it or not. Now, obviously, if Ray is correct, he's saying that a lot of the stuff out there is dishonest and deliberately so. And I think that's easy for most of us, people like you and me, and probably many of your listeners, to believe. I've thought for a long time that the promotion of confusion and mystery has been a key part of the strategy by the true assassins. And it's unfortunately, I think it's succeeded. It's probably beyond their wildest imaginations, and because there's so little agreement on many basic issues in this case, and we're really in a strange place. And I think, and have been for a long time. Does anybody even still care about this anymore, outside of a tiny minority of people like us? I really wonder. I think a lot of people don't. That a lot of that has to do with the passage of so much time. Most people who are alive today weren't around at the time. But, a large part of that is because there's so much conflicting information and so much mythology surrounding the case and so much, BS that, most people are just going to throw up their hands. What do you even believe? As for everyday regular people, after 50 years, the assassination is just a history lesson and a really confusing one at that. But as the late Gaten Fonzie once said in a speech at JFK Lancer, make no mistake, we know the truth. We know the truth. We know there was a conspiracy. And as Hal Verb, the late Hal Verb said in Dallas one year, I heard him say, speaking in the grassy knoll, that the truth may set you free, but in this case, the truth should make you mad. And the truth is that our democratic process was nullified by bullets. So that's my I should get off my soapbox now, but that's my grand my grand conclusion.
Well, I've got to say that I can argue with not a single thing or a single sentiment that came from Mr. Marcus or yourself right there. It really does seem to me as though a lot of this was purposely done. I think that there may have been some honest mistakes, but the concept of completely making the waters so muddy that there's no reason to attempt to even swim in them so many years later has definitely succeeded. And it is really a sad fact. And I think that he is right, and I think that you're right also. And 150, I remember sitting down to count one time the book titles that I could recall. I came up with about 300. And I did the same thing you did to try and remove the peripheral titles, and still came up with a number of about 300, and that was, 10 years ago.
Yeah, and they're still coming out, too.
Every month, it seems. Every month, and some of them are just, I don't even know how to describe the nonsense that I'm witness to sometimes,
So let's not even dignify them by talking about them. Let's of course, I want people to find and purchase my own book, Praise from a Future Generation. But I would also recommend Accessories After the Fact, if you can find it, by Sylvia Marr. Her last name is spelled Meagher, Sylvia Marr. I would also recommend probably one of the most important books of recent vintage, JFK and the Unspeakable, by James W. Douglas. It was published by Orbis Books 5-6 years ago, I guess, maybe a little bit longer ago than that. A book called Brothers by David Talbot. I would absolutely recommend that book. I mentioned Into the Nightmare by Joseph McBride. James D. Eugenio has several books out. I'm drawing a blank on some titles right now, but James D. Eugenio, you can find his books out there. Those are certainly worth a read.
Destiny Betrayed.
Destiny Betrayed is one of them. He republished that. He rewrote it, and it came out again, a second version of that book. The first one was about 20 years ago, and then, he reworked that, and it came out, I think, about it within the last year or so. But there's a lot of stuff to avoid, and don't want to mention any of the titles by name, but because I don't want to dignify them.
No, I hear you. And I'll tell you what, I want to thank you again for coming on tonight. And definitely,
I want to thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Definitely do look up Mr. Kellen on, you can find him on, I know you can find his book on Amazon right now. There's probably a couple other places you can find it as well. It is in the ebook version now, so it's in a Kindle version, but the hardcover, the trade paperback of it, I think is still kicking around a bit.
That's hardcover.
It's still hardcover?
Just the one and only. It never came out in trade, alas.
Oh, okay. You know what? I have the hardcover, but I'm like a nut. I always want the hardcover versions of books for some reason. And,
Good for you.
It's just I don't know. To me, that's a book.
Yep, I agree.
But really, I can't thank you enough for coming on with me tonight and discussing this. And I hope that we've given some people, some of the original stuff to go look at. It's a whole lot less confusing when you look at some of the very early research, and a great number of that, a great many of those still. At the age of 19 in 1962, she was
See, but I have the files. You know, I read this stuff at the National Archives, and I read these other things. I said to myself, how can that be possible? The brain, you know, pistols and fondle slab of choice, I don't know, computers, internet, professional wrestlers, and not Jesse Ventura style. It doesn't matter where the information comes from as long as it's real. It doesn't. It's hard to get real information because seriously, they want you to just read.